So I'd like to welcome you to our panel, Retouched Voices, What a Farmer's Market and a Rock Album Have in Common. So my name's Jennifer Wilson, and it's been a pleasure for me to work with the two panelists here today. Their projects, which I will give you a hint, have something to do with a farmer's market and a rock album. They were very different in content and also in form. So we've had a really fun semester thinking about the commonalities in theme and the challenges, the common challenges that the two projects represent. So before I introduce the panelists, I'd just like to thank Shavalika Gandhi and Alan Strauss and his students who provided us with some really good feedback a couple of times during the semester. And I'd like to thank Jen Riegel for all her support for this program. So our two panelists today, Lauren Hoffman and Andres Perez Volkow. So Lauren is a second-year student, major in journalism and design, and Andres is a BAFA student, majoring in jazz and contemporary music in Lang. So I would tell you more about their projects, but I think I would rather leave it up to them. So thank you for coming, and I'll let them get started.
Hey.
Hi. So yes, I'm Lauren.
I'm Andres.
And this is our project, What a Farmer's Market and a Rock Album Have in Common. So to start, like Jen mentioned, when we started this project, we really didn't know where to go with it because trying to incorporate music and journalism was a little bit of a challenge. And so basically the way that we're going to set this up is we're going to briefly explain our projects, just kind of brief summaries. We're going to go over some of the core themes that we found, and then we're going to break down our stories into more minute details because there are a lot of pieces to our stories, and then we're going to kind of wrap it up at the end. So I'll start. My story is about a market. It's Essex Street Market, which if you've ever been there, it's at the corner of Delancey and Essex Street. It's a historic market. It's been there for about 70 years, and this is a story I wrote as a final for my News Narrative and Design 1 class, actually this week last year in April. Sorry. The market it's interesting because it's basically just vendors who they all come from different, not necessarily chain restaurants, it's family owned and different places like that. They all kind of conglomerate in this huge market in Essex Street. And historically, it was this market where you weren't really able to enter from anywhere other than the subway. They had, they used to have livestock and stuff like that there. And now it's more of a fish market. They have bakeries, actual grocery stores, stuff like that. And the reason I wrote a story on it is because it had been set to move in January of 2018 to right across the street to a place called Essex Crossing, which is part of Bill de Blasio's affordable housing market initiative that was launched in 2011. And it's basically moving directly across the street to this huge conglomerate building with affordable housing on top. And from what I've understood, they're adding a lot more vendors, a lot more restaurants. I think there were talks of a movie theater, this whole nightlife space that's really going to drive the competition up in the area. And the really big problem with this is that all the workers I spoke to when I went there to interview have no idea what's going on. They aren't sure if they're going to get raises. A lot of them are full-time, unsalaried. At the time, they were paid less than minimum wage. Now it is minimum wage since it was raised this December. There was just a lot of uncertainty of what was going to happen, and for a lot of people at this market, English is not their first language. And but from what I understand, the people who are in charge of the move and are in charge of facilitating the move from Essex to Delancey are corporate bigwigs and not necessarily anyone that lives in the community. So that's a brief overview of my story, and I will pass it off to Andre so he can tell you more about his.
So my project basically goes around 3 questions. How do you record an album on a budget? How do you release an album on a budget? And how sustainable is this? It basically talks about the past 2 years when I decided I wanted to actually release some of my music. At the time I was living in Mexico City and performing in clubs and bars, and just I said, okay, what does it take to actually release stuff? Because everyone says it's so easy to put stuff on Spotify. Spoiler, you can just get GarageBand and release an album on a budget, but I'm gonna I'm going to talk about how to do it with recorded instruments, a studio, and more people involved. And yeah, so you can see that it's difficult to trace commonalities between both of our projects, but we did find two very big ones, and one is sort of facing gigantic market monsters, just being a tiny human being with just not so great finances. And yeah, you'll see why this is one of the commonalities. This is an image of Shadow of the Colossus. We need to give copyright, by the way.
And then the other commonality that we found was community base. So this is actually a photo from Essex Street on top of one of the closed stalls of one of the people I interviewed last year. The stall is no longer there. I'm not sure if that's due to the move or due to it closing because of money reasons. But I thought this was interesting. They asked students from PS 20 and a silver school to draw, their second graders, to draw what community means to them. And these were kind of all up in the market when I went, which is something that I've never seen before. And that's another huge theme between ours, is communities and what communities do when they're up against a rock and a hard place, and reconciling themselves with the solutions or the decisions that need to be made or the sacrifices that need to be made to get there. And from what we found, those, in some cases they work and in some cases they don't. So we're gonna get into a little bit more detail of our actual stories and kind of break down the different parts of it, hopefully to help you guys understand a little bit more.
So we're going into my story a bit. And so I started writing songs around 2014, I think, or whenever. And by 2017, I had like 32 songs, and I thought maybe 15 were decent to be released. And I started working on that. And again, how do you record an album? Is there a book about that? Because I wasn't making a lot of money in my gigs, so I didn't know what was the steps. And you always have this image of playing and like this person in a suit sitting in the back changing your life. But I guess that you can't wait for that to happen. And well, step one, write some songs. So I'm gonna give an image of what it was. So 2017, I was sitting in my room, basically just playing songs with a simple arrangement like this. Si lleváramos las intenciones, cual tatuaje en la piel, deberíamos tantos problemas, tantos conflictos de interés. So you got that? You have your songs, you can play them with an instrument. You start getting gigs, and there's this L word, labels. So I approached and was approached by indie labels, either very small or kind of small or medium-sized. And basically I found this. You can pay $2,000 to $2,500 to get your album recorded and released, or $5,000 and they promise more stuff and tell you it will reach more people, or not pay anything and just sign a long-term contract. But it's kind of scary because it's just the songs I sing in my room. I don't want to put a price on them, or I don't know, pay. It feels weird. All this process, it's very intimidating. And well, I just thought this, I don't know, there has to be another way. I sort of felt cornered. Just so you can imagine, I was making from $5 to $50 on my gigs, and I was getting one every 2 months. So I wouldn't be recording that if I had taken either option. And yeah, I think this sense of feeling cornered is something that really happens in Lauren's project. I'm gonna hand the.
Thank you. Yeah, so this week last year, I was on a deadline for my news narrative and design class. All my other pitches fell through. I didn't know what to do. I had no story. I was very stressed. And so what do you do when you procrastinate? You go grocery shopping. So I took my former roommate and I had done a little bit of research just into goings on in the Lower East Side. That was my beat at the time, but didn't necessarily focus on the market itself. But when I got there, I noticed all of these signs about the move and all of these posters that were up. Because if you can see in this bottom, I guess it would be your right-hand corner picture, they had started building this timeline of the history of the market, which apparently had never been done before. And they added a visitor center and some other just kind of community engagement pieces. So I'm walking around and I'm like, okay, like this could be a story. Like this looks like something that's important. So I went to, well, here's some more photos. So I'm walking around and I meet this woman named Lauren, and she's at a stall called Saxelby Cheesemongers. It's an artisanal cheese shop, ? Not sure. And I struck up a conversation with her and I was like, hey, so like what's going on? Like what's about this market closing? And she tells me a little bit more and basically tells me that the market is set to close, but it keeps getting pushed back at this point. It had been set to move in January and this is April of 2018. And at that point it had been pushed back until October. So they were like, yeah, we're gearing up for this move and everything. And then I asked her a little bit more of like, this is all off the record, and then I asked her to give me an actual interview. And she was very willing to talk to me. And so I asked her just a little bit about how she started at the market and where she lives, all that. And she told me this anecdote about her life that really just stuck with me, that she bikes 8 miles over the Manhattan Bridge every day from East Flatbush. So 16 miles both ways because she can't afford the $120 it is for an unlimited Metro card, and that she also can't afford the $200 for health insurance, even though she's full-time and a manager at this stall, she still can't afford it. And that just like really stuck out to me and just really made me realize that a lot of these places and a lot of these markets that are made for people, quote unquote, in their community aren't benefiting people who live in the community and aren't paying them enough, aren't paying these people enough who should be living in their communities. So I talked to a couple other people. I talked to about, I want to say anywhere from 6 to 10 people. Only 3 really wanted to give me an interview, and I think that's purely just because I'm talking about money and salaries and rent, and it's very taboo. And the other thing is that I don't speak Spanish, and as I mentioned, a lot of people at this market, English isn't their first language. So there's also that. Yes. So we've kind of talked about our stories a little bit more in detail, and so now what? We're kind of trying to draw connections, and we realized that a lot of the connections between our stories are really in the sacrifices, and in my case, the decisions that were made with the people in our stories. And Andres can tell you more about his side.
So, step 2. Well, a demo, you've probably heard that word, street musicians selling you their demo, or your friend with a cool band. And yeah, well, a demo is sort of like a skeleton of an album. I'm gonna play. You're gonna hear that it's more complex. It has more layers, and I did it in my room without living for many weeks in this very dark League of Legends layer. So. Si lleváramos las intenciones, ¿cuál tatuaje es en la piel? Preveríamos tantos problemas, tantos conflictos de interés. Si lleváramos las intenciones, ¿cuál tatuaje es en So yeah, you can hear more instruments to start with. You can hear drums, bass, guitar, another voice awkwardly recorded with a $20 mic. And yeah, something I need to say is that it's hilarious to share a demo with producers, because it's like, no, you need to imagine that it's 30 voices instead of 2, obviously. And the guitar solo is super epic. I can't play it, but a friend can. And 3 layers of percussion and this crazy beat. So yeah, that's just something funny. And how do you get that to be something that people will actually listen and you don't need to tell them what to imagine? So in order to do that, I had to cut many costs. First of all, I went from 15 to 10 to 8 songs. Then another thing is that I'm just generally very lucky because I have very talented friends that are willing to work for free. And I'll get back to how this is not great. And so basically all instrumentalists, backup vocals, album covers, photos were done by friends. And the producers were recent college graduates I had just met outside a taco shop at 3 a.m. telling me, we'll do it for less. And they told me, we can just record at terrible hours. Nobody uses a studio at 2 a.m. And I was like, that's a good idea. And yeah, so that process was a lot of difficulties, and it just led to an album that costed around $400, which was great because it went from 5,000 to 400. But I mean, I'll get back to this, but in a way, it's very unfair that I couldn't pay for my friends' work fairly, and they had to do it for free. And of course, it's my friends, but you want to make a model that people will actually make a living of and earn money, and I don't know, have a decent pay. So I'll get back to this. And well, talking about cutting costs and making this face, I'm gonna hand the mic to Lauren.
Okay, so yes. So I decided to compile a kind of not necessarily compare and contrast list, but kind of like a timeline of changes of the market as they were not necessarily cutting costs, but kind of making changes. And the biggest thing is right now, so they have 25 vendors. It's open till about 5 p.m. Currently the market opens around 10 a.m. There are like 2 or 3 stalls, like the fish market stall opens at 8 a.m. so you can get let into the market for. And most stalls only have 1 or 2 employees, and for most of them, this is their only job. A lot of them are family-owned, so it's not necessarily outsourcing people for hire. It's like mostly a family business. And like I mentioned earlier, the market is historic and has been in the Lower East Side for over 70 years. And the way that that's going to change, this is projected from their current website as of last month. This could have changed, I'm not entirely sure. But they're going to add 14 new vendors to make 39 total, which is going to drive competition way up in terms of getting people to come to your stall and to outsource product more. And they're adding a nighttime community space, which is going to include 2 restaurants and possibly a movie theater, and kind of like the center. I couldn't find a diagram. From what I understand, there's going to be a community center in the middle, and then the stalls are going to kind of like run around it. And the actual stalls in the marketplace part is going to close at 8 p.m., so 3 hours later than it already is right now. And the nighttime center is going to close at 11 p.m., so a whole 6 hours later. Obviously, those stalls are going to have to stay open that are part of the nightlife center. And it wasn't very clear what they're going to use that center for. I think there was like wine tastings and movie screenings and book talks and very upper class type things. So not only are these people now, they don't know if they're going to get any help hiring other people, they have to hire more people or have to work longer hours. They're already overworked. They're already getting underpaid. Now they're going to have to work longer, and no one's even going to come to their stall if there are these new, forgive me for saying bougier stalls coming. and kind of ruining the livelihood that they've built for themselves. And on top of that, one of the men that I spoke with, his name is Mandel Elmore, and I'll get to him and the other people I interviewed in the third part of our talk. He was someone who worked on the budgeting team at the market, and he projected that there's going to be a 14% drop in sales once they move, and that they won't break even for a whole year. And that's on top of the fact that they have to shut the current market down for a whole week to move, because everyone has like oven hoods and the cooking supplies and all the fresh produce that's going to go bad. Like I said, there's a fish market and there's fresh produce that people, some of them grow them themselves and stuff like that. So it's not necessarily sustainable, I don't think, and that's something that Andres and I have been talking a lot about, and that's something we'll get to later as well, of are these types of markets sustainable for people who don't necessarily have a hand in them but are pawns of them. So going into this third part, so what now? We've outlined these problems, there's clearly issues, and there's issues with not only the systems but the way that people are interacting within these systems. How do these communities reconcile that, and how do they overcome them, or how do they not overcome them? And I'll pass it off to Andres.
So, step 3. Step 3, I thought was recording, and I was right. That's the best part. It's just so fun, and I don't know, I just want to give some recognition to my friends, Juanjo and Fran, most talented drummer and guitarist in Mexico City, and they really made it sound good. And yeah, so recording is fun. But what comes after recording? Releasing. And I really ignored how important this was. Because you can record something cool and get 5 people to hear it, and they might love it, but you won't be able to make a living of that. And the first thing I have to say is that making physical copies, it's just not a thing you should do, unless you're kind of mid-sized, because it's kind of like merch. People will buy it at your concerts, feel cool, and actually listen to it on Spotify. Then DistroKid and other services that basically what they do is you pay them some money and they upload your music to all streaming services. So I thought, oh, $20 to get into all streaming services. That seems like a good deal. And then the big question, should I release it as an album, which is how I intended to release it, or should I release it as several singles? And then this step, although it seems very small, it took a lot of time to figure it out. And to do that, well, I decided to release some singles, because if I released the album, I wouldn't have had any opportunity to see if it worked better. And I'm going to be using some streaming numbers and the charts I'll be using. Talk about how many streams you have a day, and that's how many times people play your song more than 30 seconds on Spotify. And Spotify is the most used streaming service in Mexico. So, and what I will try to answer is if constancy is more important than quality, which is kind of a funny way of saying it. Quality is obviously very important, but I'm going to show my numbers. So, this relates to money. And so this was my first release, which was kind of an experiment, seeing how things would go. And they didn't go great. It had 200 streams on the highest point, and then it just went down. Then I released a second thing, and it did pretty well. I thought, at that point, I was like proud. I was like, 250 a day. Luckily, I got a lot of support from all my friends, family, and everyone, and they put it into a playlist. And here I was like, 400 a day? Yeah. Then it got put into a Spotify playlist, the algorithmic kind, which is basically if you get played a lot, they play you to people that like similar stuff. Is that clear? Yeah. So then I got to this high point, and I just couldn't believe the day I woke up and I was like, yesterday your music got played more than 1,000 times, and I was like, that's pretty cool. And then I made a third release, which didn't really do well. But it kind of helped to stabilize around here instead of either here or here. If that, so like, I guess in a way that was better. And it made me think, is this the same case for other artists? And I'm gonna show numbers from friends of mine. I'm gonna hide their names. And I'm gonna sort of try to show you why constancy is so important. Because all the artists I'm gonna share are dope. They just make great music. So this first artist, and I have to say, this again is streams a day. And this is the only way in which I could get them, because Spotify doesn't allow you to get other artists' numbers. So unless you do it sketchily, which I did. So this is my line. This is my streams a day. And you think, oh, these guys are not doing so well because they have 70 a day. But they had 7,000 a day at some point. They released something, then 6 months later, they released something else, and then they stopped releasing. And now they went from 7,000 a day to 70. I'm starting to see a pattern. Second, they released. First thing goes up, second goes up, third release. And again, they have this sort of constancy going down, but they're doing fairly well with this amount of releases. That's 3. And then we have this. They released something back in the day. And then 2, 3, 4, 5. High point of 8.5 thousand. And then they go down. And like, as you can see, although it goes down, they reach the point where their constant number is around 500. And so we can see, in a way, it is related. And why I show these numbers is because at this point, my music has been played like 60,000. It has 60,000 streams on Spotify, and I've made $80. I know these guys have made a bit more, maybe like 150. The others have done less than that. And they have put a lot of work and a lot of money into that. And in a way, we will talk about this, but what I must say is that it's difficult. Maybe what the charts don't show is that these people have to pay for their studios, have to pay for the musicians to come and play. And in a way, all those streaming services make it seem like it's meritocratic because you can just put something and get many streams. It's really not like that. You need to pay for promotion. You need to pay for Facebook to show your stuff or ads. And I will give a conclusion for this after, in the end. But I'm going to hand the clicker to Lauren.
Okay, so I also decided to do some case studies of my own, and all of these numbers I found are based off of interviews I did with people. Anything you see with the squiggle, like the estimate sign, is either because the person didn't give me an estimate number, or it's something I've pulled from the current projected cost of living in New York City, so it's not necessarily what they would spend, but it's the average. So this is Lauren, again, the woman who I originally first spoke to. She was the only one I ever interviewed who actually let me look into her financial history and told me what she spent every day and let me play around with that. So all of these numbers are from her. The other 2 people I interviewed are not as detailed as this. So as it stands right now, Lauren makes about $2,500 per month. And what she currently spends right now drops her down to about $1,246 for the whole month that she has left over. And that's just for basic rent, utilities, living expenses, and bike maintenance. She told me she spends about $120 a year total on bike maintenance. When divided by 12, that's about $17 a month. I know it's not parceled out like that, but in terms of making it easy to understand, I did that. But that's basically how much she would have to spend a month for a Metro card. And then when you put it next to what she would be spending if she did pay for a monthly Metro card and health insurance, that leaves her with less than $1,000, about $950 a month. And that's not even including medical bills or any freak payments you might have, or if you want to go out at night, or if she had a kid that she needed to take care of, or anything like that. That really doesn't leave her with a lot. And she admitted to me that she does live paycheck to paycheck. And as I talked to more people, I found that that was the case with them. And this is a nice quote that she said to me, that she hopes the market isn't selling their souls when they move. And then the next person I talked to is Elvin Gomez. He works at Pan d'Avignon, which is a bakery. Elvin actually works part-time, so his numbers are a little less drastic. He makes about $1,000 per month. But he also lives at home with his mom and sister to help pay rent. And he told me that he lives in Jersey City also. So he commutes about, I think he said, an hour and a half. I could be getting that wrong, so don't quote me. And so he did tell me that he wanted to move out and find his own place and come to the city and go to school and kind of get a start on his life. But he couldn't because he wanted to stay home and help pay rent. And even after he helped pay rent, he was reluctant to tell me how much that was. That still doesn't leave him with a lot to live on until the next month. And then the next person I talked to, Mandel, who's I mentioned, he's the budget coordinator for the market. His story is actually really interesting because he actually grew up in the Lower East Side. He lived there when the market, when it was not first built. He isn't that old. He's around upper 50s. But when you couldn't enter it from the subway, and he remembers when it was just like a Puerto Rican market that people came, and it was just family-owned businesses, and everyone just kind of did their own thing. It wasn't really it was a community, but it wasn't a prominent community. And he's interesting because Mandel actually has a wife and kids, and he didn't tell me if his wife also works, but if he's the sole income provider for that household, he only makes about $2,400 a month, and he has 2 children. So I don't have kids, but I know they're very expensive to take care of in terms of childcare and education, and not to mention this is before taxes. So if the tax rates are really high, that's going to go down even more. And if he is the only sole provider, that really doesn't leave him with a lot to support his family on. And so I like this quote from him. He says, "The cost of affordability now is ridiculous." And so it just goes to show that these are sacrifices people have to make when they can't afford to live in the area that they work. And this on top of where the market isn't telling them if they're going to get help, if they're going to get raises, if they're going to get healthcare, like if they can even afford it once they get a raise. It's really scary, and that control is kind of taken out of their hands. And something I didn't mention earlier is that all 3 of these people I spoke to applied for the affordable housing lottery on top of the new market, so they would hopefully be able to move where they work. But the catch with that is that if they move out of their tax bracket and if they get a raise, they're no longer qualified for affordable housing, so they'd have to move out anyway. So they're back right into that situation again with no support net to help them. And it's horrible. It's really horrible. So, sorry, let me figure out where we are. Andres is going to play you his final demo cut, and then we're going to transition into our conclusion.
So what you're about to hear is the final version. It hasn't been released, and you're going to hear quite a difference.
Tatuajes en la piel, preveríamos
Okay, abrupt cut. Sorry. um, so yeah, just coming back to the steps on getting this. We went from 2 voices, 2 guitars, a bass, and drums, to just too much stuff. I don't even know. There was like 20 something voices and a lot of guitars and drums and percussion. And I mean, um, I will, although it's a process, this is the most as nice as it gets, just listening to a product that you really worked hard on. But in a way, what leaves a bitter flavor in that is that I, I, I don't know how to lead that to making a business model where I could pay all the participants in the album and still get that result. Because streaming pays are ridiculous. In a way, something I also want to say, and we are going to our sustainable question, is it's impossible to work on this and have a job or go to school and do the music, compose more music, and be able to release it properly. And this is what I've learned talking to the friends whose number I showed. It just takes a lot, and it, in a way, it's sad because you see people just saying, okay, I'm just gonna take my job because it offers stability, and I'm just gonna leave that on the side, which obviously makes sense, but it's sad because they are stopping from making music that could lighten your day or say something in the words you'll never think of. And yeah, so we're gonna be more free now, talk about how sustainable both of our projects, how they go around the topic of sustainability.
Yeah, so I think the main theme that we kept coming up with is this theme of sustainability. And in terms of my project, it's sustainability of living expenses and the sustainability of living where you work and working where you live in a city like this. And I think at the end of the day that this type of, I don't necessarily know if it's a business model, but this like class hierarchy in the business world is very detrimental to those who don't have a say, who don't have control over their situations. And it eventually, maybe it's sustainable for those people in high power positions, but for those of us who are actually working and trying to make a living, in terms of Andre's project, trying to produce work that's their life and that they're passionate about, it's sustainable in a sense that it can be done, but it's not sustainable in a sense that you can't really live off of it. And I think that's something that people need to consider, especially when, I'm not sure where this would even go, but like creating content or creating marketplaces or anything like that. I think that's a really big thing that you need to take into account, is not only the people who you're working with and the people you're working for right now, but them and their long-term success and long-term goals. You need to kind of consider that.
And we'll come back to this with the questions, but we'll go to another very important topic we found, and that's how do we keep these stories from disappearing? In a way, I always think back to one of my favorite bands, and someone once asked me, why do this band exist if there is no market for them? And I just thought, you haven't listened to them. You would. They make great music. They make honest content, and they just work a lot for that. One of the bands I showed tries to have gigs each week, which is just exhausting. And I remember I once read in a magazine, the boat is sinking. We are like, it was a 12-piece band, which again is not a great model, but they just, it was pretty funky. And they were selling their instruments, they were selling their stuff so that they could finance another album, which wouldn't be so great if you sold your instruments. But and coming back to like the stories disappearing, you don't know, because that band could blow up, or it doesn't have to blow up, but it could just make content that could be the soundtrack of, that's cheesy, but it could be the soundtrack of your life and add a lot of flavor to it.
I think the other thing we were talking about too is not necessarily like obviously the people in our stories disappearing. That's the number one thing we want to avoid, especially in my case when markets are, and especially this market itself is creating a space not for the people in it, but for the projected people that are going to be living there. So it's kind of like this living in the now, but leaving everyone in the dust. But we are also talking about the differences between local independent journalism and independent musician, or like independent artists, and how they're kind of outside of the sphere of relevance. And so if you don't have people perpetuating these stories, if you don't have people perpetuating the music and the content or the creation or just like their livelihoods, then they also start to disappear. So we have to really make sure that we tell people about them and keep them alive. And I think that's a really good segue into our final thoughts. The thing that we really wanted to hone in on is that our stories happened about 2,000 miles away from each other. And even though it took us like 15 weeks to figure out how they were connected, they really are. And the communities and groups of people go through a lot of different things, but at the core of who they are, it's just people facing problems and finding solutions and doing it when you grit your teeth and you just kind of throw yourself into it. So if you're ever trying to figure out where someone's coming from, just think, what do a farmer's market and a rock album have in common? Thank you so much for letting us come to talk to you.
Thank you.
So I don't know what time it is, but I think we have time for questions. So 5 minutes? Okay, cool. So yeah, if anyone has any questions on anything we spoke about, we're happy to answer. And if not, that's fine too. Yeah.
So thank you so much for sharing. Very, very moving presentation, actually. The performances, the stories, and details you shared from the personal side to the market analysis. I think they're all really hitting home at the end of this presentation. Very, very good.
Thank you so much.
Perhaps one thought, question that I can ask. I love the idea you guys kind of have concepts around two very different stories around the notion of a market. Specifically looking at the farmers market and also independent music market itself. So perhaps if you have more time, maybe there could be some examples of other types of market that have emerged that did find a sustainable model. So in economic terminology, we consider this as a failed market. Participant in this market is not sustainable. But we have also seen many times in our history, there are markets that was a failed space, but able to come up with something new, such as microfinancing, for instance. So I'm wondering if there are some spaces you guys can explore that could be relevant both for the farmers market community and also for independent market.
Yeah, that'd definitely be something worth looking into. Something in the very first stages, like when we had our first run through, we had a little test group of people, and something that someone mentioned was like the aspect of technology and how that's changed it, and how technology either radicalizes or globalizes the market, and in a sense makes it sustainable in its ongoing online presence. So that's something I'm definitely interested in looking at.
This is for Andreas. So, how has coming from Mexico to the U.S. really changed your process, and how do you try things down there, and really just connect with other musicians?
In a way, it was great and terrible, because the last two concerts I had in Mexico, both were sold out with 120 people, and not saying but but it was just going well, you know. and it seemed like it was going better. And here, my first concert, there was like 10 people. So in that sense, like having an audience, it was like starting from zero. But I think if I had one back home, there would still be something that I would go. And in another way, like meeting musicians, that's another thing. I had two very extremely talented musicians. Now, I don't even know. Just go to a concert and you'll see like the band is amazing. And I think here, people, I don't know, there seems to be more of a space for independent music. I feel there is definitely a bigger scene. Although I don't know how big. I am still like finding my way into the Spanish thing because it's not very marketable here, I think, and I hate that word. So it has good and bad things. Yeah.
Is there anything that like you can do to help the local farmers market
That's interesting. It's something I've thought about a lot. Is obviously telling their stories is one huge way. So I just try to talk to it with everyone that I meet. I'm like, hey, this thing is happening. Like, hey, like you should. I'm like really annoying to people, and I'm like, you should like listen to this thing. Like you should read this article, and I just like send people links, and they're like, stop. But I think advocating, and not necessarily in the sense of becoming an activist, but just advocating for people who don't necessarily have the means to advocate for themselves. I'm not sure if there's, I mean, obviously you could get involved with the market. They, like in the one photo that I showed with the timeline, they have a whole new visitor center and stuff. Like I just went back a couple weeks ago, and they have a lot of posters up, and there's a lot of people there. They opened like a food court area, so I think they don't necessarily want to move, so they're still trying to keep people there. So, I mean, my suggestion is if you want to help is just shop there and continue to put money towards that and not necessarily into a market that isn't sustainable. And like go talk to them, like they're really sweet people. And just like learn their stories and high five them when you walk in, I don't know. Just opening those doors instead of closing them.
Well, I guess I'm curious to know what were some of the challenges in your reporting. I'm thinking about the details you were able to get from all of your subjects, but particularly someone's financial information. So what were some of the challenges, and do you have a sense of what made people, aside from your reporting skills, what did they feel like was in it for them to let you step inside of their experience? What was some of their motivation?
So a lot of the challenges I had, obviously, like I mentioned, I'm not a native Spanish speaker, so that was a really big drawback off the bat. And I'm trying to learn Spanish because of this experience. I'm trying to become bilingual or as multilingual as possible to speak to a bunch of different people. But I did have a couple of people in the market translating for me, and then once we got that out of the way and translated, people were just really hesitant to talk to me. And I think when you say like, oh, I'm a journalist, or like, I'm here on business, like people get really scared. And I think due to that, obviously I don't want to assume, but some of the people could have been undocumented, and I think there was a big fear about that too, which I didn't realize just in, like when I was writing it, that didn't even occur to me, and then afterwards when it was published, I was like, oh, that's probably why. But for the 3 people I did talk to, they were very willing to talk to me, I think just because it's such an all-consuming thing, where like, it's their livelihood, I'm sure it's something they're thinking about 24/7, so why wouldn't they want to talk about it, you know what I mean? I don't think there was nothing like, oh, like I'm gonna get something out of it in terms of like publicity or like money or anything like that. I think it was more of like a very wholehearted, like I want to see this get changed, and I want to see it change. I want to see it get better, because the alternative is either staying or reversing, and those are not good things in a city like this. I also just try to smile at a lot of people.
Well, that's it. I guess we're finished. Thank you guys so much for coming.
Thank you.